on this.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Money podcast once again, where we talk about money and movies. Today, our guest is Lance Lafort, who is a longtime visual effects and animation guru in the industry, specifically in the recruiting area. And he currently is founder and owner of Lafort Talent Group. Welcome, Lance.
Thanks, Ryan. Nice to be on the show.
Yeah, thank you. And just as a heads up for everybody, the next podcast, actually, this is a part one of a part two. Lance has his own podcast, and so we will be jumping right after this one into his, and then we're sort of going to switch roles. So please, right after this, go over to his channel and check out that next part two. Anyway, as we move into this particular podcast, I want to first dive in and let's talk about what Lafort Talent Group does.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. I came up as an artist originally. It's part of my background, but moved into more executive roles as my career advanced. So probably similar a little bit to your background in the sense I was doing some artist management, recruiting, and working in animation studios, video game studios, VFX studios. And about 8 years ago, I started my own business. A lot of my jobs have been talent acquisition, talent management, so it seemed logical. And part of the evolution was literally friends in the industry saying, hey, I can't find a director, or I can't find a modeler or a senior department head, or can you find one for me? So it kind of just naturally evolved. And so we are a consulting boutique. We play very well in the digital umbrella of anything in digital production, whether it be vendors working for the streamers, or we've done recruiting on feature films, and everything from AR, VR, right through visual effects to animation to gaming, and anything related to that sort of emerging tech. So we've we quite often are kind of like the 911 call. Like a studio has their existing recruiting team, they go looking for someone, and they strike out for whatever reason. Maybe there's no one available, everyone's busy, they can't find somebody, and sometimes then it gets elevated to, we need to bring in a recruiting specialist to go headhunt down, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people. So that's kind of where we fit a lot. I've done other things like, hey, can you babysit a studio for a few months while we're switching heads and stuff like that. So I've been flown into different places. Our team has helped scale companies up. We did one last year where there were 40 employees and they needed to get to 100 because they've landed a bunch of projects. So, more than doubling the size of that studio quickly. And they didn't have the internal resources to be able to do that kind of thing. So we got embedded with them for about a year, impacted their workflow, their recruiting meetings, and how that flow of information went. So we built an internal pipeline for recruitment, and created a real focus for them. Because otherwise, as you know, people generally get so busy doing what they're doing that this recruiting thing, no one really wants to address it, but it happens all the time, right? It's like, how are we going to find all these people? Or how are we going to find them quickly enough, or at the rates we need? So my background in my boutique studio is our ability to, we know this stuff really well. We are specialists. We can come in. We also know some of the immigration laws and employment laws around different areas. So if there are questions around that, can we get somebody in on a visa to do this and this? Usually we've got that expertise. So that helps. But, I joke quite often that, it's like most studios have the ability to recruit, but it's not a focus. It's not a discipline. It's something they have to do,
especially if they need 100 people right away or at the end of a project, something like that.
Exactly. And I had another one before the pandemic where literally a company called and said, we heard you can help us scale up. And I said, how many bodies? And they said 442.
Oh, man.
And I said, well, wow. How quickly are you needing to do
business.
this? And they said, well, very quickly.
So you've got this huge Rolodex of people that you've worked with, or do people come to you and say, hey, I'm out of a job?
They do quite frequently, yes. People tap in to see if we've got anything on the boil that might be a fit for them. Um, and sometimes it works. Literally
Mhm.
that's happened where a senior modeler or a department head from some studio said, "Hey, I'm getting laid off next month. If we're busy and we've got an opening, great. But other times we'll call a bunch of studios on their behalf and say, hey, we've got a really senior person looking to make a move. Do you have any openings? Could we create
Mhm.
one? Because sometimes it's a conversation that's been going, but they haven't posted an ad, you
Right.
know.
Right.
And that's what I found when I was on the other side of the desk with a recruiting team. Um, we didn't always post the jobs because we already had people we recently talked to. So we go to our data list first or our most recent interviews. And sometimes by the end of the day, we'd made an offer and it was done. So that job posting never went up, right?
Uh-huh.
Um,
Right.
or sometimes we're talking to an executive and they're like, yeah, I'm going to have to replace that vice president one day. Because there's been something went wrong.
Right. Right.
Um, so, if I call and happen to intersect at the right time, hey, I've got a VP of HR or a vice president of production or an operations director looking to make a move, and they go, funny that, let's have a conversation, let's have a
Right.
coffee. So it does happen, right? It's kind of just, it's a bit, bit of a fishing trip in the sense you put a bunch of hooks in the water out there and say, hey, who's biting today, so to speak, if I could, limit it down to a fishing analogy. But to answer your question, we do both, right? Client
It,
comes to us, we need to fill XYZ,
right.
or senior
Somebody
candidate comes
comes
to
to you.
us, I want to make a move, I'm a department head or a head of production or a vice president or a senior vice president of X, and they want to do it quietly and confidentially.
Right.
So that's part of the service as well, is we're not throwing a name around the industry going,
All right. It's, hey, we have
Ryan wants to
somebody
make a
this
move.
level.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Right. We literally say so and so with a background of 20 years in finance or production or engineering, or he or she's been a head of technology at several studios.
Right.
Would this person potentially fit into your team in the next 3 to 6 months?
Yeah. And
And
I
that's
know that anonymity is big because I remember a lot of cases where they didn't even want to come into the studio when we were
yes,
all based in the studio because
yes.
they didn't want to be seen by others and say, hey, why are they here? And,
Oh,
and that get word spread so quick in this business.
absolutely. I mean, Ryan, it's funny you said that because I remember walking into a big studio in the lobby, and I had just recently started my business, and the VP of production wanted to meet me, and she had an assignment for me. So I'm sitting in the lobby, and one of the production managers I know really well, I've worked with her at two studios. She shows up in the lobby for an
Right.
interview at that place, and she's like, "You never saw me here." And I'm like, "I never saw you here." La 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 la. I did
Right.
not see you. Um, yeah, but
That's
that's
hilarious.
part of the professionalism and the fact that and when we get into that sort of situation with a candidate that's kind of being marketed, um, we would then say to the candidate, this studio wants to meet you, yes or no. Do you want to? Because we're not going to give the name until the candidate says, yes, I'd love to meet them. Here's my name. Or you know what? No, they're not on my list of places I want to work. So it's very much a customized kind of search that we're doing.
Sure.
Um, and
And
if
you're
the
based in Canada, right? You're in
yeah,
Toronto. It's
yeah.
a global industry. Do you tap into other
Oh,
locations as well, or are you focused?
absolutely. No,
Yeah.
we've done recruiting all over the world. We preferred, North America, Western Europe, but I think we fit well and the value proposition's good. Um, but I have recruited people in Korea, China, India, a tiny bit in Australia. So, but again, I'd say 99% of our business ends up being, Texas, Los Angeles, Chicago, any Canadian city, major Canadian city, and a bit in the UK.
Hmm.
So that's our traditional hunting ground. And I think with the technology we have nowadays, I've paid for all sorts of subscriptions and data lists, and um, we're able to find people very quickly, which is usually the issue, right? We're in an emergency, right? An art director just left a major motion picture
Right.
and we need somebody now. Get
Right.
us 3 or 4 or 5 people to interview immediately. And those are big asks. When the
Hmm.
business is really busy, because most of the good people are tied down to a project. And
Right.
so it
Yeah,
is a
like
real
last year,
challenge.
especially the year
Yeah.
before, it was just insane trying to
Yeah.
find those specific, especially those high level people.
Yeah, post COVID for me, it was when the vaccine started to flow because live
Mm,
action then went back to work, and all the people
right.
that had been displaced from live action, a lot of them had moved in animation or wherever else they could go, short form, back to TV commercials, you know, and so there was a group of displaced people because all the post houses ran out of inventory, had nothing to shoot, nothing to work on, so they
Right.
were laying off, laying off, laying off. And then the vaccine started. And I remember a couple friends of mine who are on-set supervisors called me and said, "Dude, it's on. It
Yeah.
is on. I'm getting tested daily. We can't eat at the craft table. There's all these restrictions, but we're
And there was like
shooting
three
again."
different units. So if one
Yeah,
person got COVID, then that unit was thrown out and the next
yeah,
was thrown back in. So you needed like
yeah,
3 times the amount of people just for one shoot.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
crazy.
so then I noticed because and then I think everyone else felt the squeeze because there was a huge ramp. Everyone,
Hmm.
all the movies that have been put on hold were now greenlit at the same
Right.
time, right?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
it created this tsunami, like a huge wave of studios hiring quickly, and then eventually they tapped out the inventory of people.
Yeah.
And they tapped it out globally. Like you
Yeah.
couldn't take it off to a service studio in Asia because they're backed up 6, 8, 9 months or longer. So we were super busy because we were kind of like that, uh, you know, the 11th warrior, the 11th recruiter. Like we got called in on, hey, our existing team can't find it because of XYZ. Can you help? Well, we'll bolt you onto the recruiting solution, which is
Right.
cool.
Yeah.
Even some big companies that have lots of recruiters, they just said, we are moving so quickly, we need another couple recruiters. And because you've been doing this for 15 or 20 years, we don't need to train you and get you staffed up and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Just go. Yeah.
And so we quite often I've got a small team of recruiters. We bolt it into the existing family of recruiters, and we usually slice off a piece of the pie and say we'll handle producers as an example, or
Hmm.
engineers, or TDs, or whatever, um, so that we're not all on top of each other in this kind of steeplechase to catch the talent. So, but
Right.
we just came through, some really wild stuff with the pandemic, and then
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
post-pandemic, and now we're in that sort of cooling phase again.
Yeah. Yeah. The
With
last 3 years have been just like this roller coaster ride. It's
Yeah,
been nuts.
writer strike, actor strike.
Yeah.
It's and it was amazing because literally 18 months ago, I remember saying to various colleges and universities, there's never been a better time to get into this industry right now because it is moving very quickly, but there are lots of jobs.
Right.
I think historically back to maybe 2008, where there was not a lot of movie magic going on, so to speak. There wasn't a lot of hiring going on. A lot of the bigger studios were scaling back. And
Right.
so students and graduates coming out of school were having a really hard time finding a job. And then as the streaming wars sort of heated up, that didn't happen anymore. People were getting, before they graduated, they were getting offers.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. We
so,
were
and
having to go out to colleges and say,
yeah,
let's see, who do you got coming
yeah,
through? Let's look at their reels. Yeah.
yeah, it dramatically changed for, I don't know, a course of several years there, where due to the streaming business and I think less theatrical, this, like the quality of episodic got so much higher than it had
Yeah.
been before. Um, and so the VFX teams, many people said, look, working on a feature film or episodic, the timing is a little different, but the quality isn't that much different. Years ago, decades ago, it was very different, right?
Right.
The budgets were different.
Yeah.
So it did create. I mean, we're like I said, we're on this sort of cooling phase right now. But it definitely was a bit of the Wild West the last few years.
Yeah.
Salaries crept up, uh,
Right.
kind of
Do you see them
exploded.
starting to creep
I
back down again now that the content is squeezed, based on the
Yeah,
streaming wars and based on the union strikes that have laid
yeah.
off a lot of people and all that kind of stuff?
Well, and that's it. I mean, we're not over it yet. The writers have gone back. The actors are still working on things. There's a possibility some of the video game industry might go on strike. So we're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah.
There's a ton of people out of work.
Yeah.
Not only this industry, but tech and a lot of
Right.
the other companies. We're in a bit of a cooler economy. So I would think that by and large, if you've been unemployed for several months, people are going to be different about that salary. They're going to know it's not what it
Right.
was 18 months ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that could happen in any industry, I'm sure. It cools
Oh
down.
yeah. Yeah. It's really supply and demand on both
Yes.
sides, whether it's supply and demand of people or supply and demand of the content. And if
Yeah.
there's too much content and not enough people, then the price goes up on the people and the
Yeah.
reverse. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So I'm waiting to see where it all settles out. We've done a lot of chats with people about being adaptable and flexible and um, finding other things to do with transferable skills because it really is
Hmm.
a crazy situation where even if the actors get back to strike, there's still going to be a delay here
Oh yeah.
where they get producing content and then they start shooting again. So that sort of food chain or that ecosystem around that piece of business, I'm not sure when the vendors, when the production studios and post houses are going to get busy. It could
Right.
lag it by 3 or 4 months, right?
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Hopefully not, but
Well, speaking of that, as far as what you're telling people, as far as how they adapt, um, I know it's got to be different from a junior artist all the way to senior artists on how they need to, structure themselves. Obviously, that on the junior side of things, we've seen a lot of, both of us have seen a lot of reels, and have probably a common thing, to tell people,
yeah,
put your best stuff at the front and blah 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 blah. I imagine all of that still applies in this current dynamic.
yeah.
But what about the senior artists? What are you telling those folks?
Yeah, look at the best part about the senior artists. Most of them have a really established network, so
Mm,
I'm sure they're talking to all their friends and trying to figure out,
right.
where's the work at. We've told people look internationally, be really flexible. Again, sort of one of those silver linings of the pandemic was we created work from home, right? Which we hadn't been
Right.
able to because so many big studios would say, the work all must be in a secure facility and you know, 10 layers of firewall, jokingly 10 layers, but, such that no one could hack in and get a data breach anywhere of any of the images or any of the footage or any. And so it's strange to me that when this pandemic happened, all of a sudden
It
everyone's
opened
working
up.
from
Yeah.
home. Yeah, and the security regulations that we used to sweat over. It used to be like
Oh yeah.
sometimes a 3 week steeplechase at the studio to make sure we have all the cameras and all the key cards in the right places. And
Yeah.
Disney's quality standards or security standards were different than Sony's, which were different than Apple's, which were different than Netflix. And
Right.
so sometimes you go, well, we've got 3 cameras up, and someone would say, but our spec needs another camera over here. So we're like, oh, let's go buy another camera, right?
Yeah.
Um, or there'd be a machine where anything printed off had to be under lock and key and destroyed at the end of the day, shredded,
Mm,
and so and it goes on and on from blackout curtains to a key card holder, and only, let's say, the senior editor would have that one key, and it had to be like
right.
on his neck or something, right? And so and I helped a lot of studios do those back in the day, and so it's strange, that everyone's making movies from their kitchen table or their bedroom now, or like the irony of it,
Right.
all the blood, sweat, and tears we went through is all gone.
Right.
Um, so it's
It
it's a
is nice that there's some studios still, and a lot of them still holding to try to make that continue on, whether it's fully remote or partially remote, because it was the way of the future, but some of those security measures were so over the top, and
yeah,
and I get it. It makes a lot of sense, but
yeah.
there's a lot you can do at home to mitigate some of that
Oh,
risk.
absolutely. And,
Yeah.
and look, we've been doing this now for several years, and from all accounts or most accounts, it seems to be working really well.
Yeah.
Um, and depending on which producer, some executive producers I've talked to say, well, I think we're actually a little bit behind, but I can't really tell
Right.
because I can't really get my grips on everything. But I did have a few producers at the beginning say we are so far ahead, it's almost embarrassing. Like
Uh-huh.
work from home has actually exceeded our expectations. I wish we'd done this years ago.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember a couple studios just getting rid of all their leases because
Right.
they were like
Yeah, you don't
the
need
owners.
the footprint anymore.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
not only that, the owners were like, I'm at home with my children.
Yeah.
This is good,
Right.
one of the jokes in the industry for years is always, we're working on children's entertainment and educational products, but we don't have time for our own kids.
Right.
What I mean? There was just like, we are so busy and there's such a grind to get this stuff out. So it's sort of I think it's been a relief for some people.
Yeah.
Um,
More
um,
the more the intermediate to senior people that do have families. I think that's the big one.
yeah,
I know there was a bit of a struggle with the junior folks that, wanted to be around other people and kind of in
yeah,
the studio environment. And I know that was, and still probably is, a bit of a bummer for some of them.
y-
Um,
yeah. Well, and also,
yeah,
you think of like the culture that grew, and also for training, I
yeah,
think that's the big one where you do a desk side chat with somebody and look at a monitor and talk about what's happening. Other people close by would eavesdrop, right?
right.
Sometimes that's how they got trained, was just like, oh, I'm doing that too. I didn't want to admit it to anyone, but I'm glad he's having that problem or she's having that problem.
That's
You
right.
know,
Yeah,
so this kind of organic learning happened, and I
yeah,
think you can do it on Zoom and all these other platforms, but it's not as kind of intuitive. It's not as
right.
natural. Um,
There
and
was a cool app that um, former place I was working at, one of the supervisors was trying out, and it seemed to really work for their team. Their team had,
hmm,
had all these amazing things to say. It's called Gather Town, and it's this kind of cheesy, um, you know, 1980s video game looking thing that you
yeah,
can literally build out a space, a digital space, and you have a little avatar, and you can, as you walk closer to people, the windows pop up. So you could literally build
yeah,
out your own studio, sit next to your friends, and you could still have those conversations if you were logged into this, and you could hear what the others were saying, and the
yeah.
supervisor could come to you. So it really worked well for their team. So they are trying to make solutions for that, because
Hmm.
that is a huge loss where you don't have that, that connectivity just around you, the water cooler conversations, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, no,
Yeah.
I've seen a couple like that same sort of thing where, because creates almost like video game of people at work, right?
Right.
Um, but they had one. I saw an example a few weeks ago where you could invite people into a room for a meeting. All the avatars had to run over to that, digital room.
Right.
But yeah, it was creating this kind of. It was just basically creating. They were living in a video game, and I kept thinking that at the beginning when Zoom all of a sudden like exploded, like everyone
Yeah.
was on Zoom.
Yeah.
Zoom started getting all these new features. I think, it had been a free platform before, but now there were like several tiers. Um, and I remember thinking, AR, VR, somewhere in there, there's got to be an application coming. Someone's
Right.
got to build this where we create, and it made me think of a fellow who was designing it for a couple of retailers in the States where they wanted a virtual mall. They
Right.
wanted to be able to walk with their avatar down and shop, you know, from the comfort of their home, but still have the experience that they're actually hunting for
Out
that
somewhere, and
perfect
right.
outfit, right? And so you're effectively like running through the catalog of a major retailer in a digital game, right?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I'm still, I think that could be the thing for AR, VR somewhere in there, because I still think that tech is looking for a killer app.
Right.
It's looking for the spot where
Yeah, the
consumers
Apple goggle
everywhere.
type thing, or
Right,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but yeah, it's we're going through a strange time, and again, once the strikes are over, I imagine the industry is going to lurch forward really quickly,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
It's
people
feast
have
or
now got,
famine.
yeah, people have got debts to pay off and loans to pay off, and the studios have been, some of the studios were, if they haven't already closed, will be closing. There's, some that won't make it through this.
Right.
But I talked to a senior supervisor a few weeks ago, and he said, "Hey, I'm just opening a virtual studio."
Hmm.
Because he said, now I don't have the overhead, I don't have the rental expense, I don't have the maintenance on the building, the HVAC, the taxes, the
Right.
yada yada yada. And he said this event of the strike might create many more indie studios that the benefit is you're no longer paying for that overhead
Right.
because they don't have
It,
the bricks and mortar and they don't have any
totally.
intention of getting the bricks and mortar together. So he said there might be a little bit more guerrilla style indie type studios grow.
Hmm.
And those that offer complete remote to their employees, because it's, there's a bit of a schism right now where some companies have said come back 3 days a week, 4 days a week, and some people are
Right.
like, no, I'm
Yeah.
not doing that. We did
Yeah.
a couple polls the last few years, and um, it was in the neighborhood of, I was quite surprised. I thought it'd be like 60-40, but it was 90-10.
Yeah.
90% did not want to go back.
Yeah.
Um, and of that 90%, like about a third were like, I'm cool with hybrid, but most of them were still saying, nope, not going back. Don't want to go back, right?
Yeah.
The other 10% had very specific reasons, like I live in a tiny condo and both me and my partner, my spouse and I are like on top of each other. We don't have enough room.
Right.
One of us needs a job outside the house,
Right.
right? Um, or we've got 2 dogs and 3 kids, and
Yeah.
it's
Lots of
just
screaming and
not,
barking
yeah,
and
not conducive to getting work done. Um, and some people also socially miss their coworkers that they used to all go for beer with and lunch with, and
yeah.
that sort of social aspect. So there's pros and cons both sides, but if clients ask me, which they do, I say be flexible right now because there are lots of options out there and not everyone's gone. There's no standard anymore. There's no like here's the
Right.
gold standard and everyone goes to work 5 days a week. That's disappeared. It got blown up. It got blown up, I'd say, about month 5 of the pandemic because I thought if this is only 6 or 8 weeks, everyone's going
Yeah.
back.
It's not gonna last. Yeah.
That's all it is, right? So, but that's not the case, right? So,
And it's interesting that I think that this is kind of like Vancouver prior to the pandemic was becoming the new LA, where all the work was starting to move to either Sydney or Montreal because those were all spend tax credits.
mhm.
But once this pandemic hit, it kind of made Vancouver cool again because it's a labor based, not an all spend one, and the labor base is a lot higher tax credit than the all spend.
Right.
If you're not spending the money on a building and utilities and everything else.
Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting how it has kind of solidified Vancouver again a little bit more before
Yeah.
it was literally becoming the new LA. Where it's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like everybody was moving.
Well, one of my clients that was in Vancouver a few years back had this thought that um, when all of this would cool down, they would have 2 price cards. One would
Mm.
be in studio with people in studio, and the other one would be remote.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to pay the extra money for the security of the building and one situation and so on, that was a premium upcharge because she said most of the people don't want to come back.
Right.
So she said we'd have to incentivize them with food and parties and whatever.
Yeah.
But she said, if some large client in Los Angeles said, no, we absolutely need it to go back to the way it was, she'd say, well,
That's
that's going to
interesting.
cost
That's going
us
to
a
cost
lot
you.
more.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Just because the employees now are saying almost the same thing. We all used to just commute. You paid whatever money for the commute,
Right.
whether it was
Or time or
yeah, and you drove or you took subways and trains and buses and whatever. Interesting for our recruiting in the last couple of years, we had people say, "Well, now I've got to drive downtown." I'm like, "But we always drove downtown."
Yeah.
No,
Now
not
you're gonna have to
anymore.
pay for it. Yeah.
Right. People asking for
Interesting.
special compensation. Another one, I might have mentioned this to you if we talked earlier with, uh, I'd say a fairly new employee in the industry. And I
Mhm.
called her and she said, here's the deal. I have to go down to the office 4 days a week. And I get into the office and she said, most of the production staff is all together, as an example. And she said, certain departments have been told, you're critical, you have to be here. So a bunch of us are in 4 days a week. But she said the majority of my work is Zoom calls with the other 70% of people that don't need to come in.
Uh-huh.
So she said, I'm driving all the way downtown to get on Zoom to talk to all the people that didn't have to. And so she said, like, it's grinding me up. She said, it's starting to
Yeah,
really make
I
me
could see
chew
that.
my teeth at night, So,
Totally.
so she said, if you find an opportunity somewhere else, and she said, I don't mind coming down once a week or twice a week, but this 4 to 5 days, she said, A, it's expensive, B, it's time consuming, and C, a lot of people don't have to do it. So why am I on this team that has, and
Right.
this is a conversation we would have never had 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Never had, right?
Yeah.
I remember a storyboard team on a big movie. One of the guys came in and said, I've got some personal stuff and I need to take Friday off. But I offer to work from home on Friday and do boards from home. And I said, well, let me go talk to the VP of HR. And I talked to her and she said, over everyone's dead body will this happen. And I said, what do you mean? What's the problem? She said, it's like Pandora's box. The minute one of them gets Fridays to work from home, the whole story team will be outside my door. And she said, then next week, the whole modeling team and then the animators.
Right. It
And
just
she
works
said,
through the pipeline.
yeah. So she said, no is the answer across the board. And she said, also, most of our clients don't want any work being done outside the building.
Hmm.
So she said, it's not me just being mean or me just micromanaging or me anything. She said, it is our clients have an expectation, a legal obligation we have to fulfill for them. So no, and
Right.
again, it's like we're in a Twilight Zone episode where it's the reverse of everything now,
It
right?
is.
It's
Yeah. Yeah,
so many
exactly.
people working from home.
It is.
Um,
Yeah. Well, I know we're bumping up on the half hour already, but I did because I do have a lot of pretty much half and half of young folks in the industry
sure.
versus the senior artists. What is your, I mean, I talked about the one thing that we all say, put your best stuff at
Yeah.
the front of the reel.
Yeah.
I know you also do a lot of outreach to schools and whatnot
Yeah.
and students. What do you think is your most valuable, checklist
Yeah.
of advice
Well,
for
I
them?
think, that old sort of line, this too shall pass. If you've been in the
Right.
industry like you have and I have for more than a decade, you've seen these ups and downs, right?
Yeah.
And there are times when everything seems like it's the end of this whole industry, and then something new comes about, right? Like several years ago, there was no streaming at all. We used to do DVDs and direct to TV and feature. And if one of those slowed down, it was not a good time. But then streaming happened and kind of like all the boats floated up, right? But the
Right.
volume of content went a little crazy. And also, 15 odd years ago, we didn't have Instagram and YouTube and all these other media channels that are now juggernauts, right?
Right.
Some of them were in their infancy, right? So, really, if I'm talking to anyone right now, it's like look at those newer channels, look at the newer media distribution options,
Hmm.
and also for funding, right? People can crowdsource and do all sorts of other things. So um, it's A, it'll pass. B, find something to do while you're waiting for it to pass.
Yeah.
Stay out there, tap into all your networks, keep applying for jobs everywhere, because we really don't know. There. If I do a search, which I do quite frequently, just to see who's hiring, there are jobs right now. Not
Mm.
the volume we need. I talked to a studio in South America last week, and they said we posted an ad and got 400 applicants.
Right.
And they said, well, we were calling some of them back. They didn't even remember applying. So people are just
They're just
applying
blasting.
everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Um, but in that world of all of that going on right now, there are still studios that need to get work out, and maybe it's not full time, but maybe it's contract work. We need you
Hmm.
for 6 weeks on a project or 8 weeks, but that'll string you along till hopefully the next one kicks in.
Right.
Um, and the other thing is look at adjacent industries like advertising, right?
Hmm.
Because they've got small studios. Quite often, a lot of my friends got into movies or games because they've been doing freelance work at ad agencies. Build us this little character for this smoking cessation drug or something, right? As an
Right.
example. Um, and so some of that short form stuff is still very vibrant, and it hasn't really been super impacted by the what's happening to the film biz. And when I was younger, I wore like 5 or 6 hats. I did magazine and layout. I did photography. I recorded shows. I did, junior recruiting, not recruiting, sorry, junior creative person just out of school. And
Right.
I had like 5 or 6
Do a
different
bunch of
things
different
spinning
things.
all the
Yeah.
time. But you have to until one of them becomes a full-time job, right?
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think in this kind of critical kind of downturn, that kind of adaption or entrepreneurial kind of thing has to come out. You're
Yeah.
not going to get that 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 job right now.
Definitely.
But
And it's
there
interesting
are
you say that
opportunities.
because when I graduated film school, the actors and writers went on strike 3 days after I graduated.
There you go. Yeah.
And exactly what you said is, start adapting and looking at similar things. And it just so happened at that time, visual effects still had work from before they went on strike. And that's how
Right.
I fell into visual effects.
Yeah.
And then there was a little blip as, then there was a pause because of the writer's strike and content needed to catch back up. And I think
Yeah.
that's probably what will happen again. This was a longer one
Yeah.
this time, but yeah, there will be a lot of content that will catch back up. But then also, most recently being in the game industry, when we were pitching around our project, all of a sudden all the big publishers were saying no, 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 because their funding was getting pulled.
Yeah.
And what the agency was saying was there's going to be a point where they realize there's nothing slated for 2025 or 6 or 7. We got to get who's got something going. So whoever does have those little projects going is going to, are going to get publishers very fast. And then all of a sudden they're going to need a ton of people. So I think we're definitely in a little blip, but like you say,
well, I think hoping it's going to turn around. I mean, the other thing, again, one of the things that reminds me, Ryan, is that one of the studios I worked with years ago, as sort of like a lark, they thought, well, let's just try a YouTube channel. Let's see how much that energy that takes. And let's, but it was literally like, that's not the client base we need. And that's not the way we make money. But it was like a pet project.
Right.
And I think they started to see, it's generating a few $1,000s a month. They were like, now we're going to actually assign resources to this. And now I think to this day, they've got probably 5 or 6 YouTube channels running different content. And it's actually been the growth for their studio. Cool. So it took a while, it wasn't overnight, but they started producing more and more content for YouTube, and it's basically created a lot of revenue for them. So
very cool.
I think, the traditional methods or the traditional channels and the way we think of doing what we're doing, and maybe a new generation coming into that isn't going to be as programmed to this is the status quo, right? I'm going to make it on my own. I'm going to make it this way and that way. And, those YouTube influencers are, the story of the last few years, right? They're just,
that's why all the kids want to do that, and no one wants to be a firefighter or whatever else anymore.
Animation podcasters.
My son, he's got his own podcast, and he's got over 1,000 subscribers. He's killing me. But
well, the other thing is like esports. That didn't even exist 20 years ago.
Right.
And now I've seen, you've seen them too, teams and teams of people competing, like whether it's any one of the franchises, League of Legends or any of them, where they've got sponsors. It's a sporting event now. It's become huge. And the fact that people log on to watch somebody play the game, that didn't exist 20 years ago.
It's created a whole new thing for sure. But I know we got to wrap up for this version. Again, there's a part 2 after this, so please jump over to that. I'll put a link in the description so you can just jump right over to that. But I always end my podcasts of what is your favorite film or favorite film you worked on. But because we're in October, maybe what is your favorite horror film of all time?
Wow, that's a good one. I'm not a big fan of horror because when I was a little kid, they scared the crap out of me. The one I remember, I was very young, and I think it was at a drive-in theater in the summer, and we went to see Jaws. And I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I couldn't even look at a sink full of water after that movie. It scared, like, you know what I mean? The sound of water, I immediately saw the shark and all that stuff. So it is trauma, just totally scared the heck out of me. So I think of,
classic, for sure.
When you're growing up, that one sticks out. And on the sci-fi side, I would say, Star Wars. Again, when I was probably like 8 or 9, and that came out, and I'm like, head blew up. And then the other one would be the first Blade Runner movie. I was just like, this is incredible, sort of like beats in your life where like they stand out. And I'd say Star Wars, then
life-changing events almost.
And also Avatar, not for the script or the movie, but the visuals.
The visuals were amazing.
The art direction.
I remember the first time I saw the teeth, because nobody had done realistic looking teeth before, and I'm like, how did they do that?
It was sort of stunning. I remember walking out of the theater with a bunch of my friends going, should we just go see it again?
Right.
Because I missed a whole bunch, and the 3D stereo threw some stuff off. So I was like, I'm watching the movie, but I'm like, why would you put that effect here? What were you doing? And the second time you watch it, it's more about the story. The first time is picking it apart. But anyway, sorry. There's 4 for you. I think 3 or 4. You asked me for
perfect. Awesome.
But thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate being invited on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. This is a lot of fun. And again, everybody who's watching, click on the link below so you can go over to part 2. And also there's going to be links in the description, not only for Lance's website or LinkedIn, whichever Lance wants me to post, but also there's a link to a new ebook I just released. It's free. Click on that, sign up, and you'll get an instant email to your inbox where you can click on that link and get a PDF readout of a 40-ish page